What is up, everybody? Coach Juma here, head trainer at Stupid Fit, and today we're going to be breaking down the main differences between the Romanian deadlift and the stiff leg deadlift. For a lot of people, they're interchangeable terms. They'll say it to mean the same thing and they do different exercises for them, but really they are two separate exercises. They focus on two different muscle groups, and if you're not careful, you're going to be training the wrong one, doing the wrong muscle, and not getting the gains you want, scratching your head wondering why that is. So we're going to be breaking down those differences so you can see and know and be smarter in your training and with your programming. As always, at the end of this, we're going to have our simple summary to break down everything and summarize the key points. But before getting into the difference between the two, both of these are hip hinge variations. And what that means is the main joint that is going to be flexing is going to be your hips. Your knees don't really get worked that much. And this is the most difficult movement pattern for people to master for a lot of reasons. Now, the main thing to keep in mind when hip hinging is that this is about where your hip position is and where it ends up. So jumping right into it, the Romanian deadlift is a glute-focused hip hinge movement. And the stiff leg deadlift is going to be a hamstring-focused hip hinge movement. Now, they're both going to be hip hinges, which means that the main joint that is going to be flexing and extending through this movement is your hips. And for a lot of people, this is the hardest movement pattern to master. It's a different reason for everybody, but we're gonna cover a lot of the main mistakes that I see most people doing that they don't even think are mistakes, and it's causing them a lot of low back pain, a lot of shoulder pain, and a lot of spinal issues, and not working out the glutes and hamstrings the way they want to either. So the first main mistake that happens with the hip hinge is that they are focusing on leaning forward more than using their hips to bring them down. And when that happens, their back rounds up, their glutes and hamstrings don't get activated, and all of the tension is on their lower back. So doing this for 3 sets of 10 multiple times a week is just going to strain your lower back over and over and over again and reinforce low back pain that this exercise should be helping minimize when done properly. Another thing that happens pretty often is that people are squatting while hip hinging, and they really focus on their knees to make their way down, as opposed to, again, using their hips to bring themselves down and get to that lowest point. And the last main mistake, and this one is a little more subtle and not as many people recognize it as a mistake, is they could be performing the hip hinge properly, but they have their neck extended at the end of the movement. And that throws off their spinal positioning and create excess tension on their lumbar spine, which is their lower back, and really tense up their lower back once again. So knowing all of this, knowing what to avoid, how can you actually execute this properly? Well, for one, when we look at a hip hinge, whether it is an RDL, a Romanian deadlift, or a stiff leg deadlift, you want to focus on driving your hips backwards. So it's not just about leaning forward as low as you can, it's about bringing your hips backwards as far as you can and getting a good stretch along the way. Now, when you do that, your torso is going to lean forward as a natural consequence of that. So as it leans forward, you want to keep a straight, neutral spine. So that means from your head to your hips is going to be a straight line, and it's just going to lever forward until you reach your max hinge point, which is going to be a little bit different for everybody. But the main thing to kind of imagine here is that when you are hip hinging, when you're doing a Romanian deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift, it's always helpful to think about having a wall behind you, or actually putting a wall or object behind you that you can reach backwards toward and hit your butt against. That's a really helpful cue to help reinforce the idea that, hey, I'm actually moving my hips backwards, I'm using my hips to move this, my hamstrings are stretching out, my glutes are stretching out, and I'm doing this movement properly. Now, here's the thing. When we're trying to differentiate training your hamstrings specifically versus training your glutes specifically, you want to choose the right exercise for that. If we want to focus on hamstrings, you want to do the stiff leg deadlift. As the name suggests, your legs are going to be stiff, so there's going to be almost no bending in the knee when you do this. Your hips are just coming straight back as far as you can while your legs are straight. Your knees aren't locked, you're not hyperextending your knees, but you're avoiding any unnecessary bending or flexing at the knee. And through that entire time, you're getting a better stretch through the hamstring, because the hamstring is in the stretch position when your hips are flexed, which is when you're leaning forward, your torso is getting close to your thigh, and your knee is extended. Combining all those together helps create a greater stretch effect in the hamstring and ultimately targets your hamstring more than your glutes. When it comes to targeting your glutes more specifically, you're going to want to do an RDL, a Romanian deadlift. The difference here now is that your knees are going to be bending when you are in an RDL. The main movement pattern is still the same. You're reaching your hips backwards as far as you can, but you're gonna be able to reach your hips backwards even further with an RDL because you can bend your knees a little bit to extend your hips even more. And now that the knees are bent, the hamstrings can't be as stretched. And because they're not as stretched, the glutes are able to stretch out more to help with moving you in this pattern and ultimately contracting and squeezing when you stand back up again. So again, the difference between these two is very subtle, but they'll be training different muscle groups. One is going to be focused on the hamstrings and the other is going to be focused on the glutes. A couple things to keep in mind when doing either of these is with a Romanian deadlift, you want to keep a vertical shin, which means that your shin in reference to the ground, in reference to your foot, is going straight up and down. With a stiff leg deadlift, your shin is going to be moving backwards a little bit just because you're keeping your knees straight. You're going to be minimizing the flexion of the knees, so your entire leg is going to be moving backward as a result of that. And then obviously you're creating knee flexion with the RDL, so that is going to be another difference that you can see between the two exercises, as you can see in the side by side here. Both of these exercises are going to have different endpoints for you. You don't need to reach the floor with your hands to reach that endpoint. You don't need to hit the floor with the barbell, the dumbbell, or whatever weight you're using. The end point for you is going to be when you stop using your hips. When your hips stop hinging, when you reach that max stretch at the back point with your hamstrings or with your glutes, that's going to be the farthest that you can go. Anything past that, you're going to be using your lower back for the movement, which isn't what we want when doing either of these exercises. For most people, their max hamstring stretch, their max hip hinge stretch is going to have their hands end up about their mid-thigh. As you can see in both of these demonstrations that I'm doing here, the barbell doesn't reach the floor. My hands stop just under my knees, and the exact distance is going to vary from person to person, depending on your limb lengths and depending on your flexibility. You never want to go past this point. You're not training your hamstrings better by going lower. You're not training your glutes better by going lower. You're actually taking away from the effectiveness of the exercise by doing this. So make sure that you recognize what that stopping point is. Again, if you need to have a wall behind you, have a wall behind you, have a box behind you, have a bench behind you, have whatever you want behind you that your butt can hit against as your max hip hinge point that you can accurately rely on to get and execute each and every single rep effectively. So going over the simple summary here, both of these are hip hinge exercises. With the hip hinge, we do want to focus on driving the hips backwards as far as you can, keeping a straight neutral spine from your head to your hips through the movement, and then driving your hips forward to straighten your body out again. The difference between the stiff leg deadlift and the RDL is that the stiff leg deadlift is a hamstring focused movement and your knees don't bend. You're not hyperextending them or locking them out. They're staying soft, but you're not bending them at all. You're trying to keep them as straight as possible. With the RDL, it is a glute focused movement and you're driving your hips backwards as far as you can and allowing your knees some bend so you can move your hips further back along the way as well. I hope you found this helpful, guys. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe and make sure you follow so that you can stay up to date. We're dropping videos every single week. And as always, stay stupid.